Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. Thank you for joining us. I am your host, Kevin J.N. Hughes, the director of Freed Indeed Ministries, and I really appreciate you being here. If you're new to the show, thank you for joining us. If you've been here for a while, I'm sorry that Cheryl couldn't be with me tonight. She is actually working on her final semester for the Masters University, so congratulations to Cheryl, but she is a little bit too busy. And I apologize that I am exhausted. I've been puppy sitting for the last few days for some friends of ours, and I this dog is awesome, but he is definitely a handful, so I'm really tired and didn't get a whole lot of sleep, but nevertheless, I am excited to be presenting to you today. So the first thing I would like to do is just sort of explain that today what we're going to be looking at is a common argument that's brought up by atheistic leaning people. And this argument, if I'm honest, I think it's kind of a lame argument, but I've been hearing a lot of people asking about it. We've been getting lots of questions about it, and we've also been seeing it a lot from people in the atheistic community. So, and the way they employ it, it seems like they think this is a really good argument. So we thought that we would talk about it and address it. But before we do, our sponsor for today is Raw Life Coaching. You can find their link in the description below. And what Raw Life Coaching is a life coaching service that you can take advantage of. It's an excellent service. I actually took advantage of Raw Life Coaching, and it has been awesome. It can totally change your life. They specialize in helping people find new work. They specialize in helping people to improve their marriages, all sorts of things. So whatever your goals are, whatever you're trying to achieve, you can do it with Raw Life Coaching. And like I said, their link is in the description below. You can go to www.rawlifecoaching.com, or you can email them at rahlifecoaching@outlook.com to schedule an appointment. Or you can call to schedule an appointment at 360-624-1984. But however you schedule an appointment, make sure you let them know that you've been sent by Freed Indeed Ministries, because if you tell them that Freed Indeed Ministries sent you, they will give you some discounts, and you will also be helping to support Freed Indeed Ministries with a percentage of what you're doing. So we really appreciate you doing that. And if you would like to just support Be Cool like Raw Life Coaching, and you would just like to support Freed Indeed Ministries, you can do so by following the link below to our Patreon page, where for as little as $3 a month, you can make a huge impact for Freed Indeed Ministries, and that's practically nothing. Now, So, like I said, today we will be addressing some things that have been sent to us as a question. If you have some questions for us, I have an email that you can reach the ministry at, info@freedindeedmin.org. That's freedindeedmin.org. So if you have a question, please send it there, or comment in the comment section below, and we will either make a video about it or try to get back to you as soon as we can. So without further ado, let's dive in. The argument itself is kind of interesting. So a good example of this argument is you might hear it often. Oh, hi, Cheryl.
Hi, sorry. than me too.
No, you don't have to be sorry. Like I said, this is our master's student, finishing her degree. What you looking for?
Sorry, this is real life, people.
Hashtag IRL.
The tea that I made you, where is that?
I don't know. You never gave it to me.
Okay, this is your tea.
Oh,
I accidentally took yours.
Thank you very much, my love. No. Well, surprise for me. That's awesome. And I'm really happy to have it because I just, like I said, we have been puppy sitting, and I just took that dog for a long run, hoping to tire him out before we did our show. And he is not tired or thirsty or even panting, but I am doing all of those things. So thank you, Cheryl. Now, the argument itself is interesting because basically this argument boils down to, you'll usually hear it in some form of, you're almost as much of an atheist as me. I only reject one more God than you do. That's usually the way this argument is structured. But I'm actually going to look at it in a way that it has been sent into us. So I'm going to bring it up here, actually, and that way you can see it. Just need to find it in my files here. I apologize because I had it up earlier. There we go. Okay. So now let's... I'm going to share the screen and get that up. Or not. Maybe not. Okay. I apologize. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties here. Oh, here we go. Why not? So here's my thing that I wanted to share. So this is the way it was sent in to us. I apologize that it's not exactly the way. So it says, question, prove God doesn't exist. Answer, that's a tough one. Show me how it's done by proving Zeus and Apollo don't exist, and I'll use your method. So really, that's the same argument that I was just saying before. The argument of, you're almost as much of an atheist as me. I only reject one more God than you do. So yeah, so that's the argument. Like I said, I don't think it's a great argument, but you can see why atheists employ it. It's because they're usually, like in that meme that I just showed you that was sent in to us, the reason where it comes from is like, if someone were to say, prove God doesn't exist, and then they say that. But I often hear it also as a positive argument of, well, you're almost as atheist as I am. So, same argument, different skin. But I want to start by just admitting that I have never thought that you can't prove God doesn't exist. I've never thought that was a great argument. So I'm going to lay the foundation and explain why. Sorry, I keep saying bleh. So the grounding for that argument is that the vast majority of the world's population believes in some kind of a God. They believe that some kind of God has planted us here on Earth, or has created us for a purpose, or something to that effect. Even many people who are not religious in nature, like deists, believe in a God. They just don't believe that that God has a purpose for them. And by the way, I know that classical deists do believe God has a purpose and often are very religious people, but modern deists tend not to be. So, yeah. Now, with that grounding in mind, then the atheist claim that there is no God may strike one as a rather preposterous claim, and the argument goes that you then have to demonstrate that claim, because you're the one making an outlandish claim, and therefore you're the one with the burden of proof. All that is true, and in that sense, I think this can be a good argument, but that framework is not often established first. And so oftentimes what it is more like an atheist will say, can you prove God exists? And then a religious person will say, can you prove he can't? And then the atheist will respond with something like the meme I just showed you, oh, well, prove to me that Zeus doesn't exist. So, okay. Like I said, this isn't my favorite argument from Christians to begin with. I personally think that it falls short because it just passes the buck. Or at least that's the way it comes across. Like I said, if you have the framework in place, it can be a decent argument. But I think it comes across at least as passing the buck, and there are better arguments out there. In fact, I'm going to recommend a book, which I don't have on my desk here, and that book is 5 Proofs for the Existence of God by Dr. Edward Feser. That's F-E-S-R, F-E-S-E-R, Dr. Edward Feser. And what Ed Feser does is he sets his phaser to fun. No, I'm just kidding. He takes some classical arguments for God's existence and teases them out philosophically, and you get to see the proofs that for God's existence. He also has some great books arguing for the truth claims of the Christian faith specifically, and there's many good books. I actually have a great book on my shelf over here. It's called Good God. It's a fundamental examination of the moral argument for God's existence, which was actually popularized a lot by Immanuel Kant, even though he himself was not a Christian. At least not that I've ever seen. But he still believed in a God because of the argument from morality. So there's lots of good arguments, lots of good proofs, if you will, so I don't think it really makes any sense to resort to, well, you can't prove he can't. I don't think that's a good argument. Nevertheless, it's an argument that gets employed. This is a response that we often hear from our atheist friends is, well, true, I can't prove that, but you can't prove that Zeus doesn't exist. Okay, fair enough. Let's assume that the said framework has been established. Let's assume that the atheist has now been pressed with this argument, and let's assume that they've responded with, you're almost as much of an atheist as me, prove to me that Zeus doesn't exist, and then whatever you say is how I'll prove that your God doesn't exist. Okay, how can a Christian respond? Well, let's break this down into a couple of points and address it that way. So the first thing I will note is that this argument is actually a straw man. And the reason why this argument is a straw man is because Christianity does not teach that Zeus and Apollo do not exist. Christianity does not teach that these beings are figments of the imagination. For example, I should say, we actually teach that Zeus and Apollo do exist, that Zeus and Apollo are fallen beings from the divine council, fallen angels from the divine council, just like all of the other gods of all of the nations. So, for example, Justin Martyr, in his apologia, which means his defense of the Christian faith, he asserts that when pagans refused to embrace Christianity and instead continued to worship false gods, they were actually following evil entities that were deceiving them. Nowhere in Justin's apology does he say that these evil beings do not exist. He asserts that there were actual evil beings that existed and had evil intentions for these people and were accepting their worship. Saint Paul, in his epistle to the Corinthians, his first epistle to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 20, Saint Paul says that those who have eaten meat that has been sacrificed to idols are eating meats that have been sacrificed to demons. And he talks about things being sacrificed to demons. So again, St. Paul never says that, well, the gods of the other nations just don't exist. No, he says that they are fallen angels. St. Augustine is another one in the City of God. He makes quite protracted arguments. Never does he make any argument that the gods of the Roman pantheon or any other pantheon don't exist. But he makes protracted arguments that these are false gods because they are evil entities that are taking worship away from the Most High God. So some things to consider biblically are in Genesis 6, we read that when the human race sinned after the flood that's recorded in Genesis, the human race sinned by trying to create, it says, a tower that would reach to heaven. Now, that doesn't mean that they were building a skyscraper. The word for tower there is actually the same word that the Hebrews would use to describe a ziggurat. So, if you don't know what that is, it's an ancient temple. And basically, what this ancient temple would do is its purpose was to control a god. So these people were attempting to control God. God says that he will not be controlled by man. This is not something that the God of heaven does. In fact, if we go back a little bit further and read Genesis chapters 1 and 2, what we quickly discover is that the first chapters of Genesis parallel, in the creation narrative, they parallel the writings that we have about the creation of ancient Near Eastern pagan temples. Not found in scripture, but like in Akkadian mythos, they actually recorded how gods would build temples for themselves. And the Genesis narrative echoes that, except there's a key fundamental difference, and that is that instead of man at the end of the narrative making an idol and opening up its nostrils for the god to come in and dwell, instead you have God making a man, making an icon of himself, an image of himself, and then God breathes the breath of life into the man. So you have it in reverse. Instead of man making an idol so that he can take control of God, you have God making a man so that he can utilize man for the functions of putting the earth in right order, and he gives man dominion over the earth. So that's, and so when we get to Genesis 6 and they're trying to make this ziggurat to take control of God, what they're trying to do is reverse the created order, and God will have none of it. So we read that he divided the nations up according to the number of the sons of God. In Deuteronomy 32, it says that when he divided the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. And then in Psalm 82, we read what those gods were supposed to do. It records that Yahweh is at the head of the divine assembly, and he says he has an indictment against these gods that he's appointed over the nations, because he appointed them for the task of caring for humanity and guiding them back to the Most High God. But instead, what the gods have done is turned man's heart away from the Most High God to themselves and have begun to accept worship. And because of that, they have become fallen beings. beings. So we see that now. A great resource for you, if you're new to this concept, I would say a great resource for you is the Lord of Spirits podcast. I have a link in the description below. From a Protestant perspective, I also am greatly fond of the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, so you can check out his work. He has a couple of books. My favorite is Reversing Herman, and he talks about this a lot. And so, but Lord of Spirits comes from an Orthodox perspective. So obviously at Freed Indeed Ministries, we recommend that one the most. But we also appreciate the work of Dr. Michael Heiser very much. And I want to point out that there's actually a point in Plato's writings where he describes the early state of human relationship to what he describes as the gods. And when he describes this early state of human relationship, it's interesting that it runs parallel to, or I should say, it runs along the same lines as what we just saw in Genesis. So, in Genesis, we see that when God divided up the nations, he divided them according to the sons of God. And then we see that in Psalm 82, what the purpose of that division was and what those beings were supposed to do, how they were supposed to lead people back to Yahweh. And Plato actually describes a time when the Most High God, whom he refers to as Kronos, which is the original Most High God of Greco-Roman religion, and Kronos divides the nations according to the number of the sons of Kronos in Plato's writings. And then Plato says that from that point on, the gods, because they were gods, they had no reason to compete with one another. And so they did the will of Kronos, and they didn't overstep their bounds, because far be it from a god to overstep the bounds of what was his rightful place. On the other hand, they were kind to the human race, and they guided humans, and they cared for them, and they did justice for the oppressed, and all of these things, which, interestingly enough, is exactly what Psalm 82 says that Yahweh, the Most High God, commanded the lesser spiritual beings he had created to do when he made them to be gods over the nations. So Plato is interestingly echoing, with obviously without knowing it, because there's no evidence that Plato was ever exposed to the Old Testament. He's echoing the biblical narrative that we already saw, but he's echoing it from a pagan perspective. And then as he goes on, he talks about how there was this, we would call it a fall, but he doesn't, because he's viewing it from a pagan perspective. So he talks about how then, Zeus takes over the divine council, he overthrows Kronos, and he becomes the head of the divine council. And now the gods vie with each other and create warlords, and the human race is thrown into turmoil, which is interesting because that too echoes the biblical narrative that the gods turned away from Yahweh, the Most High God, and they have subsequently led the nations away from the Most High God when they were appointed to lead them to him. I would also note that within pagan mythology, we see some common themes coming up over and over again. And before I get into those, some of these are actually pretty widely known. So, for example, it's no secret that almost every culture on Earth has a flood myth. It's no secret that all throughout the Earth, there's almost everybody has some sort of myth about a flood that wipes out an antediluvian world. So that's very interesting. But what's not often said is that there's actually a lot more details that all of these cultures tend to have in common. So, one of the most common themes within pagan culture is, or I should say within polytheistic cultures, polytheistic religions, is that you'll see a description of a most high god. So there'll be a god who is set above the other gods and is usually seen as the creator of these other gods. In ancient Babylonian mythology, that was the god El. The god El was the highest god, he was the most high god, and he actually created all the other gods. He created Marduk, and Marduk actually rejected the authority of El, and he ended up slaying El, and he takes control of the Divine Council. And then there's this whole battle that takes place where he's taking control of the Divine Council, and that battle actually produces their creation myth, because he slays these two beasts, and one of the beasts he uses to create the sky and the other he uses to create the earth. And then once he has overthrown the most high god El, he is then able to create humanity basically to be his slaves. So that's and this is a common theme throughout the ancient polytheistic world. Even in Roman religion, we see, as I alluded to earlier, Greco-Roman religion, we see Kronos creates the other gods, and then those gods rebel against Kronos. They cast Kronos down, and then Zeus becomes the head of the Divine Council, and then Zeus actually becomes the creator and liberator of mankind. So what we see is there's almost always a depiction of a most high god who is then overthrown, and then there's a pantheon of gods established. So from a Christian perspective, we realize that this is actually a form of propaganda in which the fallen beings are trying to essentially assert their right to dominion by telling a partial truth and saying that the ancient most high god was actually a bad guy, and so we had to overthrow him so that we could be your beneficent gods. Well, Christianity says that's not true. Christianity says that, guess what? The most high god is actually the benevolent one, and you couldn't have overthrown him even if you tried. So the only thing that you could do is attempt to overthrow him in the hearts and minds of men. So in other words, going back to that atheist argument, the argument is you're almost as much of an atheist as me because you reject all these other gods, whole pantheons of gods, and you only need to reject one more to be an atheist. That's actually not true. That argument would work against, say, a Muslim, because Muslims really do believe, at least as far as I have discerned, Muslims are true monotheists in the sense that they deny the existence of any being, any god beings, lowercase g gods, and affirm that there's only Allah. Christians are not that. Christians reject the idea that any of these created gods, lowercase g, deserve worship, but we affirm that all of these beings exist because our scriptures teach that they exist and that they have fallen from favor with Yahweh because of their rejection of his authority. And again, we covered a lot of this on our talk with Matthew Emerson, Why Are There So Many Religions?, which you can see a link to in the description below. But going back to that atheist argument, what we can say is, no, we're not almost as atheist as You are, because we acknowledge that the Bible and the church fathers are correct when they say that there is one true triune God who is worthy of worship, and there are many gods who are created by him, some of whom have rebelled against him and none of whom are worthy of worship. So like Saint Michael, he's not worthy of the archangel, he's not worthy of worship, but he's not trying to take your worship. And Zeus and Apollo, they're not worthy of worship, but they're willing to take your worship. It should also be noted that many modern atheists have been quite successful with their propaganda. So much so that many Christians have fallen for the trap. So many Christians are not educated enough in their faith to know that Christianity doesn't teach that, and many Christians are, you might say, practical atheists in their day-to-day life. Many Christians live as atheists 6 days a week and then worship God on the seventh day. I don't mean literal seventh day. I mean they worship God on Sunday. But besides that, they really, for all intents and purposes, their day-to-day life maybe isn't that far removed from an atheist's day-to-day life. And that's a problem, which is why I recommend listening to the Lord of Spirits podcast, which I've linked below, because they help to correct a lot of that. I'm not going to get into all of that here. We probably will get into more of it throughout the course of our time in this podcast, but suffice it to say, for now, listen to the Lord of Spirits to supplement what I'm saying here. But modern atheists have been successful at getting out their propaganda and their narrative, which is touted all over the world by people who probably should know better, but their propaganda runs something like this. People used to be polytheists. People invented the idea of gods to explain nature that they couldn't explain or to feel better about whatever. And then people eventually outgrew their gods, but kept monotheism as a quote-unquote crutch. Thus, atheists become the ones who have broken free from this entire system. Interestingly enough, this view was not created by atheists. It's actually a holdover from German liberal Protestantism of the 18 and 1900s. So in German liberal Protestantism, the view runs actually very similar to this view, except basically it goes further and further and further until German liberal Protestantism is the savior of the world rather than atheism. German liberal Protestantism has broken free of the system. Atheists just took it one step further and said, no, German liberal Protestantism wasn't quite good enough. Atheists are the final step. But this whole entire approach is actually ahistorical. The reality is quite the reverse of what was just said. Ancient people recorded interactions they had with various beings. From that, they derived their understanding of the world around them. It was not atheists encountered, it was not a bunch of people in the ancient world encountered lightning, couldn't figure out what was causing it, so they invented Thor. Rather, it was that they had interactions with a being whom they called Thor, and because they had these interactions with this being, when they saw lightning, they associated it with Thor. That's what we actually see the pagan people saying happened. That's their narrative. They didn't invent their gods. Rather, their gods explained the world to them. So they formulated their religious ideas based on beings they had encountered, and then formulated their worldview around their religious ideas. And if you think about it, that makes a lot more sense than the idea that somebody said, "Hey, Krug, why is there lightning?" And then this caveman said, perhaps there is a god. And then the other guy said, "Oh, that is an interesting thought, Krug. Let's create a complex religious identity, complete with a priesthood, and then let's base our entire morality on this idea that you just came up with." That doesn't make any sense. And there's no reason why humans would make life more complicated than it needed to be like that. Now, there's also another reason why this argument fails, and ironically, it's the same problem that I spoke about earlier. When people say, "Well, you can't prove God doesn't exist." Well, I admit that that version has some framework, like I established earlier, that works to a point, but um, I just don't like the idea of just hitting the ball back. Like, to me, a debate is different than a tennis match. The goal is not to just keep hitting the ball back and forth until one of us misses. Um, it's not a game. We need to address arguments and refute them. That's what I love about Dr. Ed Fazer putting forward his 5 proofs, which he's getting from other philosophers. He didn't just come up with these one day. But the point is, what I love about Dr. Edward Fazer is that he's not saying, "Well, you can't prove God doesn't exist." He's saying, "I can prove God does exist." And then he's putting that forward. And if any atheists want to, they can try to challenge him on those points. So to me, that's what a real debate looks like. It's not just bouncing things back and forth and hoping that your opponent will finally get stymied. That said, the atheist response ends up committing the same error, saying, "Well, you're almost as much of an atheist as me." Well, that really isn't addressing the question of not being able to prove that God doesn't exist. Okay, so all you've done is show that that I can't prove that Zeus and Apollo don't exist, and also you can't prove that Yahweh doesn't exist. So therefore, maybe they all exist, which is actually, as it turns out, the Christian claim. So, just to kind of recap a little bit, this commits a straw man fallacy that asks Christians to prove something that an informed Christian shouldn't be believing anyway. Informed Christians would know that Zeus and Apollo, for example, are real entities, and that those entities have very real purposes and intentions in the world around us, but these entities are fallen. And I'll also address maybe some things that somebody might push back with. So the main pushback that I've usually gotten when presenting this to people who have asked this is, well, if that's true, then how come if these ancient people were actually encountering these beings, then how come people today don't encounter these beings? That's kind of the same question you get with like vampires, fairies, all of these things. If ancient people were actually having any sort of encounter with something that they called a mermaid, then why is it that we don't see mermaids today? That's an error. You're assuming that what they encountered is a biological entity that we could find skeletons of, for example. And that's not actually necessarily the case. These could be spirit beings, and if they are, which is what Christians believe, that all of these entities are spirit beings, well, then all of a sudden we see that when Christianity conquered in various places, then all of the fallen spirit beings would be driven out, just like St. Patrick. There's the story of St. Patrick driving out the snakes. It doesn't mean that St. Patrick stamped his cane and things that slithered left the island of Ireland. That's not what that means. It's not literal. He drove out ancient demonic entities that lived in Ireland, and they fled from the preaching of St. Patrick. And so, I will say that many people, so atheism is a uniquely Western phenomenon. For the most part, you don't see atheism in other parts of the world. And the reason for that is because these people still very much encounter spiritual entities. The reason why most people in the United States and Europe don't is because in the US and Europe, Christianity has conquered. In places where Christianity has not conquered, or where Christianity has been thrown off, like the Middle East, which was once Christian but was taken over by Islam, we see spiritual forces come back. In the Middle East, they have jinn. The jinn are a good example of these spiritual entities coming back after Christianity was driven out in those lands. In Africa, in South America, many of these things are still happening, and you don't see atheism taking root in places where Christianity has not thoroughly conquered. Nevertheless, I think we will see, as secularization increases in the Western world and Christianity off of Western nations, I think we'll find, and we are finding, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. All I was saying is, I think you'll find, and I think we are finding, that in said places, the entities do return, and even here in the US, I apologize. We're almost done anyway. So the point I wanted to make was just simply, as secularization increases, we're seeing more and more of these phenomenon happening again. And I think that will only increase if secularization is allowed to continue. And so I suppose we could say that that's maybe a warning for the future. But either which way, that is what we have today. So thank you for watching. Well, we addressed that atheistic argument there. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us on some of those technical difficulties and on our, real life things. This is a live show, so sometimes we have live show problems, and that's okay. So make sure that you show us some support by liking the video. Go ahead and comment with your thoughts, questions, concerns, whatever. Feel free to send in questions to info at freedindeed min.org. That's freedindeedmin.org. Support us on Patreon, where for as little as $3 a month, which is practically nothing, you can make a huge difference for Freed Indeed Ministries. And of course, Please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed by the blood of Jesus Christ. Thank you so very much. God bless.